Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever it is for you. Welcome to the Ledgie Podcast. I'm your host, DJ. Thank you for joining me today. I just wanted to talk about fantasy basketball. I did a fake episode before the first episode that was posted yesterday, and I just wanted to do more of the fantasy aspect, kind of give some people some ideas of who to add on the waiver wire. My team is a 15-team league. Don't ask why it's 15 and not 16. My manager, I guess, just forgot to add another person, and when we tried to get some people added, it was too late because the draft order was set. So there was really no way to change it, which is actually pretty funny because our league manager is just a big fool. So today I just wanted to talk about 3 different categories of players and look at some stats. There's going to be the fantasy buy low, the fantasy sell high, and then the fantasy it's probably too late to add them from the waiver wire. It's over for you. So that's just that last category is going to be pretty interesting. It's just going to be 5 different players that kind of have blown up in the past few days, past couple weeks, and were just recently added, and maybe that they've been dropped and added, dropped, added, but now it's pretty consistent. They're going to be a good part of their team. They're going to be able to give you consistent fantasy points. So to start the fantasy buy low, I would go with OG Anunoby. I actually have him on my team, so if anybody in my league watches this, they're probably going to try to trade me for him. But he has been pretty inconsistent, especially on this 1-5, I believe it is, Raptors team, who's been playing pretty awfully outside of Lowry and Fred VanVleet. Everyone's been inconsistent. There was the Pascal Siakim sitting, and it's just last game, OG Anunoby had 10 points, 1 assist, 1 steal, 1 turnover for 9 fantasy points, at least in how my league is doing points. But, it's relative, so 9 points is really low for my league. So if he got you 20 points in your league, that means 20 points is probably low for your league. And especially we're doing the one where all the categories kind of combine together, so it's not going to be you get 10 points, you get 1 steal for a different category, and you get another category for assists and another category for blocks. It's just kind of everything's added up to equal fantasy points, kind of like how fantasy football does it. At least that's how I did fantasy football. But recently he's been putting up a ton of minutes, but the big thing is he's just not consistent. He had 9 fantasy points this week, or on the 4th, and then on the 2nd against New Orleans he had 23, and then before that 11, then before that 38, before that 21, and then if you even go back a little bit further, 22 to the first game of the season. So overall, he's averaging, 20.7 fantasy points, which isn't awful, but I think looking at his recent 3-week stretch and with kind of how the Raptors are doing, he's someone you might be able to get for a low price. Okay, moving on here, let's look at Marvin Bagley. He's another player that you should be able to get pretty easily. He's the 16th ranked power forward center, and his average points are 16 a week. Or, sorry, not 16 a week, 16 every day, every time he plays out there. But he averages over 20 minutes. He hasn't been playing less than 20 minutes. His least amount of minutes played a night was 21, and that was on the 26th of December. But he's kind of been trending down. The first game of the year on the 23rd, he got 22 points, and then the next game, 23, 15.5, 19.5, and then to a low 8.5, then back up to 17.5, and then back down again to 6.5 fantasy points. I don't know how much of this has to do with his dad requesting a trade for him instead of him going to management asking for a trade, so I don't know what to believe on that, but this is kind of one of those players where if he gets out of this system, he really might be able to strive somewhere else. And I think it's kind of funny because his coach is Luke Walton, and when Walton was with the Lakers, he had Lonzo Ball's dad criticizing as well, so it's kind of funny. He just can't catch a break when it comes to angry parents on the teams, but overall, if this guy can get to a different team, he can be a factor. He's a non-factor on this Kings team. But if he goes somewhere else, he really might be able to help out and actually get you a ton of fantasy points. And one of the trade rumors that I heard was him going to the Hornets, and I think he would have all the opportunity in the world just because their big men situation is kind of weird. I know that they have Cody Zeller and Bismack Biyombo, but this guy would really come in and help right away. And moving on, I want to talk about Miles Bridges on the Hornets just after getting done talking about them. He is a player that really started out the season really hot, and a lot of people were really surprised. So his first game was against Cleveland. He put up 12 fantasy points, but he had 6 points, 6 rebounds, 1 assist, 1 steal. And then the next 4 game stretches, he was outstanding on the defensive end, getting 21 fantasy points, then 20, then 41.5. throughout those games, he at least had one steal, and then he had 2 blocks in all of those contests. And with his points 14, 10, 20, there was also a 16 rebound game, and that went with his 20-point, 2 assist, 2 block game. He did have 5 turnovers, which brought his score down, but he ended up with 41.5 fantasy points. But since then, the most he can crack is 15. And I know it's only been 3 games, but some owners might be pressing the panic button saying, this guy was one of my better players. Now I really need to get rid of him, try to cycle him out. And this might be a point where you could get him for pretty cheap, especially after his last game. He played 24 minutes with 7 points, 5 rebounds, 3 turnovers for 7.5 fantasy points. And his minutes actually have been going down as well. So on December 30th, he had 30 fantasy points, and since then his most is 26, and then he had 2 24-minute games. So that's just one player that you might be able to get, and that I really think he's going to turn it around, especially because, like I said about Bagley, he's going to have all the opportunity in the world, especially playing with LaMelo Ball, one of the league's already best passers, and him being one of the league's best dunkers. I think it just gives him tremendous opportunity. And moving on now to one that I don't know if a lot of people will agree with is Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. He was taken, what pick was he taken? He was taken the 3rd round, and he's not really producing 3rd-round numbers recently. He started off the season hot. He was out the first game, and then his first game was on the 26th against Charlotte, which was the Thunder's second game of the season, playing 34 minutes, having 24 points, 7 rebounds, 9 assists, 1 block, 5 turnovers. And that's kind of the line you'd expect from him, especially being one of the only guys on this Thunder team. And that was for 34 fantasy points. The next game, he had 23 points, 3 rebounds, 7 assists, 1 steal, 1 block, 4 turnovers for 30.5 fantasy points. And then the last game, and then the next game after that on the 29th of December was his tied for his best game of the season, but it's the best game he's had since. So he hasn't had a good game since this game. He played 33 minutes, 23 points, 7 rebounds, 7 assists, 5 turnovers for 34 fantasy points again. And since then, he hasn't been playing too well. He got 15.5 fantasy points, then 26, then 20. So I just know that's going to be a struggle on this team just because the minutes are just so out there. They're trying to give a lot of people opportunity, trying to see a lot of different players, see how they're playing. But he's a guy that I think a lot of people expected more of. Like I said, he was taken in the 3rd round in my league. And I bet you in a lot of leagues he was taken either in the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th. I don't think he would drop below the 4th, but he's 99% rostered, averaging 26.7 fantasy points. But the last 3 weeks have been pretty atrocious, and I don't know if that's really going to change. But it's definitely one of those players that, because he's the best player on that Thunder team, he's definitely a guy you might be able to get for a little bit cheaper cost. Moving right along, Delon Wright of the Detroit Pistons, the new Detroit Piston shooting guard, point guard. He's averaging about 15 points a night, and he's 57% rostered. He started out the season pretty strong. So the first game he only played 19 minutes, had 12.5 fantasy points. And the next 2 outings he had 28.5 fantasy points and then 29 fantasy points. And since then, 7, 3.5, 16, 7.5. And one thing you have to realize is Killian Hayes just got hurt last night. He had a hip injury, which sucks because I'm getting his jersey in March. So I hope he can really recover and just become the player that the Pistons hope he could and all their fan base hopes he can be. But that's besides the point, and maybe for another video or another podcast. But looking at the Pistons depth chart right now, they already lost Josh Jackson. So, I mean, this guy's going to get a lot of opportunity at the 2 guard and at the point guard, because without those 2 pieces, I mean, who do they have left? Derrick Rose, Wayne Ellington, Svi Mykhailiuk, Frank Jackson, the guy they picked up for their 2-way, and then Saban Lee, their 2nd-round pick. But I don't think they're going to get a lot of minutes. So I think Delon Wright's a guy, if you go get today or tomorrow, you could get pretty lucky. So I would try to get him before the next time they play. And those were my 5 choices for buy lows. And I don't know if you'd agree. Maybe in the comments, type some you think. Just kind of let me know how you feel about that. And moving on to the sell high players, is the first one up is Chris Middleton. He's been very solid, but the only minus to that is he's been trending downwards since the beginning of the season. So his first game he had 51 fantasy points, then 42, then 28, 34, 22, 29, 26. So he's around that 25 fantasy points a night. Over the season, he's averaging about 33.5 points a game, but don't let that surprise you. He's really around the 25 mark in the past 5 or 6 games. So that's something that really should be considered. You might be able to move him for some pretty big pieces. Some people might really be attracted to the Bucks and really just think that he's going to be consistent because the team's good. I'm not really sure what people will think, but you just have to know that he's really trending downward. So if you have him, I would look to get rid of him. If you have your heart set on him, whatever, don't take my advice, I guess. And moving on to another player is Darius Baisley. He was a guy I actually picked up at the beginning of the season, then dropped, then picked up again. He's been trending upward, and I think that's really good. And I know we talked about Shea, how the minutes are going to be inconsistent because they're trying to get a lot of people looks. And that's the same thing with this guy. The past 2 nights, he had 28.5, then 38.5 fantasy points with. On the fourth, 16 points, 8 rebounds, 2 assists, 2 steals, 1 block. And then on the second, he had 19 points, 12 rebounds, 2 assists, 1 block. And those are solid stat lines, especially for a second year on the Thunder. But like I said, they're going to be getting people a lot of different looks on this team. I don't know if I had trust in him in the way I do Shea, in terms of being consistent on this team where they're going to be continually changing the roster. So if you have him, you might be able to actually sell him high just on the fact that he's had quite a few good games. He's averaging 23.5 fantasy points. He might be ranked 24th in the position rank, but I always think that having people to play multiple positions is great, especially when you have a small forward, power forward, which you don't see a ton in fantasy basketball. So I just think that he would be a great guy to try to go after, especially if you're needing some of that power forward depth. I know I am. I'm probably not going to trade him, but I know in other leagues, if you have too many power forwards, I would look to move on. If you watch basketball, it shouldn't be much of a surprise that Pascal Siakam is next on my list. And looking at his fantasy stats, it hasn't really proven me right. He had 26 fantasy points his first night, 42, 22.5, and then he had that game where he sat out for disciplinary measures. And that is interesting to me because nobody really knows why, if it was an on-court issue or an off-court issue. But then the next game he had 11.5 points, which was a huge dud. Then he had 29 yesterday against Boston in a loss. And with this team, there is no guarantee that it's going to stay the same. They're 1-5. They're probably panicking. They might have some trades lined up. I know they've looked to trade Kyle Lowry. They're probably looking to trade Siakam. And I know Siakam probably will be a part of any deal for James Harden. And you look at that the Rockets team that he might go to with Christian Wood, PJ Tucker, Cousins. They have a lot of bigs, and they have a lot of guards and small forwards that can play that four. So I really wouldn't see him as a valuable asset on the Rockets, but that's definitely not like the sole reason to trade him. I just think just because of how this roster is looking, and if they try to tank, they might be trying to looking to give other guys more minutes and to try to look at other guys and kind of really figure out how they fit on their team so they can come back strong next year. So I just don't see Pascal Siakam really making a huge impact for the rest of the year. He might have some good games here and there, but I think once we get into that two-month away mark, he might really be kind of a non-factor for this Raptors team. And the last player that I want to talk about for the sell highs is Markelle Fultz. And I could be very wrong, but the Magic have come back to earth from starting, 4-0, being that only 4-0 team. And he was really solid to start the year with 21.5 points, 32 points, 26 points, 31 points. Then he kind of dropped off 15.5, 20, 15. And it all started once he played against his old former team, the Philadelphia 76ers, on the 31st on New Year's Eve. And I think that might have just gotten to his head because he was playing really solid before, but then he just kind of fell off a cliff, hasn't been able to score more than 12 points. So if you're basing his production off of the 31st, he's definitely a guy you want to try to get rid of, especially also because of their 3-guard rotation with him, Cole Anthony, and Michael Carter-Williams. And they have some of those guards playing the off guard at some points, but if you have a point guard playing an off guard position, they're probably going to have to handle the ball as well, because I know Michael Carter-Williams is not an off-ball player. He definitely needs to have the ball to succeed. And with all those reasons, I just think he's just a player you need to move on from. You might be able to get some good assets still. I wouldn't wait too much longer, because if he stays bad, he just lost all of his value that he had. And moving on to the last player in this, I think I said Markelle was the last, but he really wasn't. This might be the worst hot take of this video, or the biggest hot take of the video, and that's Monte Sabonis. He's the second-ranked power forward center in the league, and I believe it's behind Julius Randle, who has been having an outstanding season. I really would like to see him and the Knicks succeed. As much as I don't really care for the Knicks, I mean, it'd be kind of funny to see them do better than the Nets, but if they meet in the playoffs, I know the Nets will sweep them. But that's really besides the point, and I just want to get into his stats real quick. His first game, he had 50 fantasy points with 32 points, 13 rebounds, 5 assists, and 1 steal. Next game, he had a triple-double, 22, 10, and 11. Next game, he had 19, 10, and 5, then 14, 11, 8, 25, 11, 7, 13, 13, and 4, 19, 11, and 7. And the least amount of fantasy points he's had is 33.5, and he's averaging 43.8. So you might be asking, DJ, why would you really say to sell high on this guy? You should really just look at the amount of minutes he's been playing every night. 37, 34, 41, 37, 37, 39, 35. That is not, that's not going to be sustainable, especially for a big guy who plays the power forward center. When you see Joel Embiid rest a few games, you see Joel Embiid play 25, 30 minutes a night. When you see any big guy, especially a 7-footer, play these amount of minutes, I think that's definitely something to be concerned, because even if he doesn't get hurt, it's just him running out of gas early in the season and just seeing him just kind of slowly fall down the ranks from position rank 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6. So you could really be sold high on him, and you could really say, okay, I want to hold on to him right now, and I really want to wait to see if he does that, because maybe keeping him and getting some of his value now before he goes down might be worth it to you to try to win some games. And maybe you think, DJ, he's not going to be bad. What are you talking about? Hold on to him. But if you're not really sure and you kind of understand what I'm talking about, especially with the amount of minutes he plays, you might be able to sell him for a huge haul. You might be able to get 2 decently solid, 2 second-round kind of quality players. So that's definitely somebody to look for. And now moving on to the waiver wire steals, where it's probably too late to grab. Coming up first is going to be Isaac Akoro, the small forward for the Cleveland Cavaliers. He's position ranked 63, averaging 10 points a night, and his roster in 6.3% of the leagues. He's been hurt since Game 2, where he played 42 minutes, had 3 rebounds, 1 steal, 2 turnovers, and 1 fantasy point. That is not an attractive fantasy line. I'm just going to say that right now. You look at his first game, he had 34 minutes, 11 points, 3 rebounds, 5 assists, 2 turnovers for 19 fantasy points. And you see what other small forwards on this team have been doing. They've been doing absolutely nothing. This is definitely a guy that might come back and be an instant impact for them. He hasn't played in the past 5 games, but I think when he does come back, he's going to be an instant impact. And if he's not picked up, I'd really recommend picking up and holding him, putting him in your IR, and just waiting to see if you can reap the rewards with him. Next up is Payton Pritchard. It's probably too late to pick him up. I know I had him picked up. I dropped him for someone else, and then Jeff Teague got hurt, scored 31.5 fantasy points, putting up 23 points, 2 rebounds, 8 assists in 32 minutes. He's going to get all the minutes in the world once because Kemba's out and Jeff Teague is out. So really the only competition he has is last year's rookies with Tremont Waters, Carson Edwards, people like that. Marcus Smart will probably start at the point guard. Or actually Tremont Waters started, Pritchard coming off the bench, but I think that might change unless they want to have a change of pace off the bench so they don't have Pritchard, Jaylen Brown, and Tatum all trying to score at the same exact time. So actually, that's probably the way to work out. Let's backtrack a little bit. Let's get back to what we were talking about. Pritchard is just one of those players that will just be solid until the ladder comes back. So if Teague comes back, he'll take a hit. Once Kemba comes back, he'll take an even bigger hit. But if you have Kemba or Teague, that's going to be an issue when all 3 of them are healthy, because they're not just going to not give Kemba minutes. Kemba's a star, because that would be awful to do to a player like that. But when you have Payton Pritchard balling out and helping you win some games, he's definitely going to be a player you want to keep getting minutes. He could be your backup point guard of the future. Heck, he might even be your point guard of the future if you don't think Kemba's the right fit. So he's definitely a player. If he's not added, I'd be very surprised, because that means no one in your league knows basketball or looks up what to add or anything like that. He's definitely a player to keep on your radar, especially if somebody just stupidly drops him. And next up will be Naz Reed. He has been very solid for the Minnesota Timberwolves on a team where Karl-Anthony Towns has been hurt, and they've been very inconsistent on offense. His first night against Detroit, he had 18 fantasy points, then 11.5, 21, 14.5, 26.5, 16.5. So it's every other game he has a good game. And I know he plays tonight against Denver, so that'll be another game to watch out for, especially if he's still available in your league. But I highly doubt that, especially because a player like this, especially when Karl-Anthony Towns is hurt, is definitely one that you should have and hold on to, especially for those situations where there's an injury. And he's going to be able to produce for you. So that will be a very solid pickup for you. And lastly, we have Joe Harris, who's averaging 19 fantasy points, and he's at least in my league, been dropped and added a bunch of different times. He was drafted, then dropped, then added, then dropped, then added again. And he's just a player that has been very solid this whole season. He's only had a couple dud games, but I don't think those dud games really outweigh what he's done positive for this Brooklyn Nets team, who is kind of struggling because they're kind of resting their players quite a bit. Kevin Durant hasn't been playing a lot, and now he has that thing where he has to quarantine for 7 days, and that's really going to open up the door for Joe Harris even more, and maybe even Taurean Prince you should look at. But if Joe Harris is available, definitely pick him up, but I believe it would probably be too late in your league. But overall, this has really been fun, kind of spewing my thoughts into Audacity on fantasy basketball. I really hope that I can help make a difference on your team, because I'm really hoping I can make a difference with my team by researching a little bit more. And I hope to do this maybe once a week, maybe once every other week, just kind of see what happens with that. But nonetheless, I'm DJ. Thank you for joining me on the Ledgie Podcast. I hope you have a good day.